found out that there is no mention of a city called Mecca in any of these writings at all. And she went back and tried to find out what was happening in Mecca and couldn't find out anything. The first mention of the city of Mecca does not come until 724. That's almost 100 years after the death of Muhammad.
Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today I stumbled across this video and oh man, this one is intense. We have got Jay Smith, a Christian scholar who is doing his PhD on the historical sources of the Quran, going head to head with Shabir Ali, president of the Islamic Information and Dawah Center from Canada. And let me tell you, Jay Smith brings up some research from a Cambridge University scholar that is going to make a lot of people very uncomfortable. We are talking about historical evidence, ancient manuscripts, and a question that nobody wants to ask. Did the city of Mecca even exist when they say it did? So make sure you watch until the end, because this debate gets heated. And please comment down below where you are watching from. I really love to see people from all over the world connecting in here. Alright, now let's get into the video.
One of the things we have is the early church fathers, because the early church fathers what they started doing is they started taking and they started quoting the gospel accounts right from the very beginning, right, left, and center. We have men like Clement, Ignatius, Polycarp, Justin. These were men who were living in the first century. And as they started quoting them, they started writing them in their letters, and we've been able to amass their letters. We've been able to put them together. And we've found 32,000 quotations from the New Testament alone in these early church fathers' writings that predate the 3rd century. And there has been somebody, a man named Dr. Dalrymple, who has put together and amassed these 32,000 quotations. And what he has found is that you can reproduce the entire New Testament except for 11 verses just by looking at their quotations. That means we could throw away the manuscripts if we needed to. We could throw away the manuscripts if we needed to and just go to the early church fathers and come up and reproduce those letters. I'm sorry, those documents, or you might say the books of the New Testament. What about other evidence that we're looking at? And what we're going to do is let's do a comparative now between what we see in the Bible and what we see in the Quran. One of the real problems with the Quran is the whole historicity of the earliest, the first beginning of, you might say, the inception of how Islam began around the life of Muhammad. And of course, as Shabir said, that all these stories that we get about the Quran and all these stories that we get concerning his life, which are found in the Sirah of the Prophet that he mentioned, and in the Hadith that describe not only what he did, where he did it, how he did it, and who he was talking to, these stories don't come from his lifetime at all. They don't come even anywhere near his lifetime at all. Let me just put up that graph again if I can. If you look at the names of the people who wrote these Sirahs, and who wrote the Hadith, the names of the individuals that are credited with it. Ibn Ishaq is the name that is the one that is the most authoritative on the Sirah of the Prophet, but Ibn Ishaq died in 765. Muhammad died back here in 632, so you're talking about a good 130 years later. Ibn Ishaq was not an eyewitness to the account. He was not there. He lived 130 years later. How did he know what was happening? Shabir says that he knew because he could trust accounts that came through these isnad, these names, these people who had heard it from so-and-so, who heard it from so-and-so, who heard it from so-and-so. And all the way from the time of Muhammad right up to Ibn Ishaq. We can't even refer to Ibn Ishaq. We don't have his writings. We have to go to a man named Ibn Hisham, who died in 833. That's 200 years later that we have to go to. That means we're dependent on writings that happened 200 years after the fact. Why? Why is it we have to wait so late to hear about Muhammad's life, to find out what was going on, to know and get body and history behind what was happening there in Mecca and there in Medina? Why is it we have to wait so late? See, we're not talking about the 1st century anymore. Remember, with the scriptures, we have to go back to the 1st century when we would not expect to find documents because of the fact those documents have deteriorated. The originals have deteriorated. We're talking about the 7th century now. Paper was invented, was created in the 4th century. There are hundreds of documents. I've already mentioned there's 230 documents of our New Testament alone from before the 6th century. Why is it we can come up with so many manuscripts of what was happening and what Jesus was saying and what was happening around him? Is that 5 minutes? Why is it we can come up with so many, but we cannot for the Quran? That's a problem in and of itself. And one of the real problems that we've come up with is the city of Mecca. And this has been a really niggling point ever since 1987. Dr. Patricia Crona from Cambridge University came out with a book called The Rise of Islam. And Meccan Trade and the Rise of Islam. And she devastated an enormous amount of people because what she found there was very interesting. She went back and she looked back at the stories. She went back and looked at these Marghazi Siddha documents. She went back and she looked at the document, the supposed, or the Muslim tradition that supposedly talked about what was happening in the 7th century, and she asked some very damaging questions.
All right, so Jay Smith opens with this analogy that honestly is so simple but so effective. He is talking about witnesses. He says, imagine something happened right here in this room with 300 people watching. If everyone wrote down what they saw, you would get 300 different accounts, slightly different details, different perspectives. But that is actually how you verify something really happened. You compare multiple independent witnesses and piece together the truth. And then he makes this comparison that I think catches a lot of people off guard. He says, the Bible has multiple witnesses. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, different people writing from different perspectives about the same events. 3 of them were actually there. They saw it with their own eyes. But then he asks this question that just hangs in the air. The Quran only has 1 witness, 1 man. Can we trust him? Now, before anyone gets upset, understand what he is doing here. He is not being disrespectful. He is applying basic historical methodology. In any field of study, whether it is a courtroom or archaeology or ancient history, multiple independent sources are always considered more reliable than a single source. That is not a Christian rule. That is not an anti-Islamic rule. That is just how verification works. And here is where it gets really interesting. Jay brings up Patricia Crone. Now, for those who do not know, Patricia Crone was a scholar at Cambridge University. This is not some random person on the internet. This is a serious academic who spent her career studying early Islamic history. And she decided to do something that honestly should have been done a long time ago. She went back to the earliest sources, not the Islamic traditions written 200 years later, the actual contemporary sources from the 7th century, Byzantine historians, Greek writers, people who were alive and documenting what was happening in that region at that time. And Jay says she asked some very damaging questions.
Where are the sources for these stories? Do they match what we find in 7th century records? Because if you are claiming something happened in history, you need evidence from that time period, not stories written centuries later by people who were not there.
She first asked, she said, where are the sources for these stories? Where do they come from? And do they parallel what we find in the 7th century? Because if you're going to talk about what was happening here in the 7th century from this far late in the day, then how do you know you can trust what was happening, what they were saying? Because you're talking about a 200-year interval. A 200-year interval when there should be no interval, because at this time there was an enormous amount of documentation that was being written all around that part of the world. Not only in Arabia, but certainly up in those areas that had been conquered by Arabia, the Byzantine and the Sassanid empires, or Baghdad, Basra, Damascus, Jerusalem. All of these places, Cairo, Alexandria, had come under the power, had come under the authority of the Arabs at that time, and they were writing. And it's these documents that they were writing that Patricia Crone went back to and came out with some very interesting conclusions. She found out that there is no mention of a city called Mecca in any of these writings at all, and she went back and tried to find out what was happening in Mecca and couldn't find out anything. The first mention of the city of Mecca does not come until 724. That's almost 100 years after the death of Muhammad. She went back and she looked and she found out that Mecca is one of the most important cities because it's where the sanctuary is. It's where Ishmael and Abraham came and built the Kaaba. No historical documentation to support that, but she went back and said, since it's such an old city and such as it was a center of the trade at that time, certainly we should see something that refers to it. She couldn't find anything, not at all. Nothing to refer to the city called Mecca until 724. What was even more devastating is when she went back and she looked and she decided to try to find out what was the trade that went on in this city called Mecca. She went back and she found out that the trade that existed all the way up from the 1st century, all the way up in the 7th century, did not at all go through a place called Mecca, didn't even go up in that area. It went up the seaway, and you can see it on this map here why that's important. The trade that was coming from the east over here in India and was moving all the way over to the Mediterranean, it should, according to there we got it. According to the Muslim traditions, was taken off board and went right up the coast, right up here, all the way up to the Mediterranean. She didn't find any documentation for that. She went back to the historians. She went back to the Byzantine historians, the Greek historians, Cosmas, Procopius, Theodoretus, read these historians who were writing in the 5th and 6th century, and what did she find? They don't at all mention that there was any trade going up the west coast of Africa. It went right up the Red Sea.
This right here is where the debate takes a turn that most people are absolutely not prepared for. Because Patricia Crone did not just ask questions, she went and actually looked for answers. And what she found is genuinely shocking. She went through every historical record from the 5th, 6th, and 7th centuries, every Byzantine document, every Greek historian, every contemporary source she could find. And here's what J. Smith reveals. There is no mention of a city called Mecca in any of these writings. None. Zero. The first time Mecca appears in any historical document is 724 AD. Let that sink in. That is almost 100 years after Muhammad supposedly died. Now think about what Islamic tradition tells us about Mecca. This is supposed to be the holiest city, the place where Abraham and Ishmael built the Kaaba, the center of a massive trading empire with caravans moving goods from India all the way to the Mediterranean. If all of that were true, would not somebody have written about it? Would not at least one historian from that era have mentioned this incredibly important city? But it gets even more problematic because Jay brings up the trade route issue. Islamic tradition says Mecca was this wealthy commercial hub, but when Patricia Crone actually traced the historical trade routes using maps and contemporary records, guess what she discovered? The trade did not go through Western Arabia at all. It went up the Red Sea, the sea route. And here is the part that really hurts. That sea route was not even controlled by Arabs. It was controlled by what is today Ethiopia. The city that keeps appearing in all these historical documents is not Mecca. It is Adulis, an Ethiopian port city. So you have the holiest site in one of the world's largest religions, and there is no archaeological evidence for it. No contemporary historical mention. And the trade empire it supposedly controlled has zero documentation. Jay is not making this up. He is citing academic research from one of the most prestigious universities in the world.
Was not even controlled by the Meccans, was controlled by what is today Ethiopia, and a city that is repeated over and over is Adulis. Now, this is devastating in and of itself, and many people will say, hold on a minute, who is Patricia Crone? Why is she saying this? Can we trust her? What she is doing is something that all historians should do, and all historians must do, and that is you must go back to the earliest writings. You must go back to the earliest documentation that is closest to the event. When you do that, you will probably come up with a totally different story than what has been told us from the much later documents that we see that the Muslim traditions are referring to. How much more time do I have? 1 minute, thanks. The same thing must be asked also about the Bible. Because, see, the Bible does not claim to be a historical book, does not claim to be a historical document, yet it does have a lot of history in it. It does talk about peoples, places, and events, as does the Quran. And when it does talk about people's, places, and events, you need to go and look and see whether or not they can be corroborated by secular history. And what we're finding out is the Bible over and over and over again is being corroborated by secular history. You can come with us to the British Museum, and we'll give you an hour-and-a-half tour just going through the British Museum here in London and showing you all the corroboration for Shalmaneser and Sargon II and Jehu the king, and especially Daniel, that we can find right there. You can look at it, see it in the cases that corroborate what we see in the biblical account. Now that's exciting to me, because once you find out that historically the Bible does show that it stands up to historical verification, then you can trust what the Bible has to say. If you can, by using that same criteria, apply it to the Quran, and it collapses using that same criteria, then you need to ask the question, can we trust what else it has to say? I don't think we can. We need to begin, and you need to ask the same question of both scriptures. Are they verifiable? Are they credible? What you're finding is that the Bible proves itself to be credible. The Quran, using that same criteria, has very little credibility, and I'll stop there for now.
And now, Jay drives the point home in a way that is impossible to ignore. He acknowledges that some people might be skeptical. Who is Patricia Crone? Why should we trust her? And his answer is perfect. He says what she is doing is exactly what all historians should do. You go back to the earliest writings. You go back to the documentation that is closest to the events. That is not bias. That is basic methodology. See, here's what people need to understand about how ancient history works. The closer your sources are to the actual event, events, the more reliable they are considered. If I told you something happened in the year 600, and my only evidence is a document written in 800, you would rightfully be suspicious. 200 years is a long time. Stories change, details get added, things get embellished. This is why historians always prioritize contemporary sources. And Jay makes this comparison that is absolutely devastating. He points to the Bible and says, look, we have manuscripts from the 2nd century. We have archaeological evidence you can go see at the British Museum right now. Inscriptions mentioning biblical kings. Assyrian records confirming events in scripture. There is physical corroboration that you can actually verify. But then he applies that same standard to early Islamic history, and the whole thing falls apart. The earliest biography of Muhammad comes from Ibn Ishaq, who died in 765. That is over 130 years after the events. And we do not even have his writings. We have to rely on Ibn Hisham, who died in 833. Now you are talking about 200 years between the events and the first written record we can actually access. Jay is not being unfair here. He is being consistent. Same standard, same methodology, applied equally to both traditions. And when you do that honestly, the results speak for themselves. This is not about attacking anyone's faith. This is about following the evidence wherever it leads. So what do you guys think of this?
Leave your thoughts down in the comments. Please like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.